Okay then, hi. Today we're going to be tackling sourdough, and this is where the process starts with getting your starter fed and ready to bake some bread with. So, what we're going to need for this is a set of scales, a jug or something to put your new starter into, some water, some flour, and of course your sourdough mother. This is COVID. COVID was born in April of last year, along with many other sourdough mothers across the world, and she's done me well since then. So, first things first, what we're going to do is take a little bit of the of the mother to make our new starter culture. Okay, and what we'll do then as part of that is feed the mother at the same time. So, all the various measurements for these can be found on the blog at partisanblog.com. So if you head there, you'll be able to see all of the weights and measures that we're using for this today. So, that's ready for our new starter. What we do need to do is feed our mother just to make sure it stays healthy and able to produce bread. So all we do for that is we replace whatever we've taken with the same weight. 50% flour, 50% water. Roughly. Don't worry if you're a couple of grams out on this. It's not going to make too much difference. And there we go. You should probably keep your mother jar a lot cleaner than I keep mine, but I use it pretty much every day. So she's ready now to go back into the fridge. So, we have then our new starter ready to go. We have a little bit of the mother, and to which we're going to add, first of all, some water. Give that a little mix in. It's easier, I find, to add the water first. The starter mixes in a little bit more evenly that way. And then our flour, the same amount as we've added water. Give that a mix in. So, and then what you're left with then is a just very rough, quite lumpy dough that's ready to go. And what we'll do now, we'll pop this in a warm place to start coming to life and start being able to raise the loaf, and then we'll come back and have a look in an hour or two and see if it's ready to pass the float test. So this is the next stage of the process. Our starter has been left for actually about 3 hours this time around. My kitchen's particularly cold today, but it looks like it's full of life now. As you can see there, it's nice and bubbly. It's increased in size by about 50 to 75%, I would say. And what we're going to do is what's called the float test. We have a glass of just cold fresh water. I'm going to take a teaspoon of the starter and drop it in the water. As you can see, hopefully, what happens is the starter bobs straight back up to the surface and floats in the water. This means that it's ready to bake with. There's enough life in there that it will raise the loaf. So let's crack on and do that now. So, first things first, we've got our lovely, lively starter in there. Back on the scales. And as before, we add the water first. For the amounts of all of these, the weights and measurements, head to partisanblog.com where you'll find the full recipes for everything. So we're just mixing that starter now into the water. Water's a little bit less than room temperature, it's not long out of the tap, which will slow things down a little bit, but that's absolutely fine because we're going for a longer rise with this bread. Next up is your flour. And for this recipe, because we're just doing the real basic sourdough, we're using just ordinary plain strong white bread flour, but obviously you can use any combination you want. At this stage, this is just the rough early mix. So I tend to do this again just with a spoon, just because it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater, and it doesn't really make any difference at this point in time. Bring it all together, not worrying too much about it. This is only a rough dough at this stage. Just trying to make sure we work in all those bits of dry flour at the bottom. And for now, that's where we're going to finish up. What I'm going to do is this is going to sit under the ragged cloth, and we're going to leave that now for another 40 minutes before we add the salt and the next bit of water. So I'll see you in 40 minutes. Right, well, it's been 40 minutes since the last time we were doing anything, and nothing's much to change with the dough. But what we're going to do now is we're going to add the second part of the water along with the salt. So the salt has been dissolved into the water already. All we do is we don't add the salt right at the beginning, just to give the sourdough, the natural yeasts, a chance to really get lively, because salt will actually calm them down a little bit, if not kill them if you put in too much at the beginning. So, what we're going to do is this. Work this water with the salt into the dough, nice and simply. Lift and fold. So keep turning, just lift up, back on itself. Fold it in, turn the thing, and just keep. And then you see really quickly the water and the salt have been pretty much all absorbed into the dough. We're going to leave that another 40 minutes, and we'll be back then, and hopefully you'll start to see a little bit of a difference. So if we had wanted to, at the last stage, we could have taken that dough with the freshly mixed in with the extra bit of water and the salt, put it straight into a loaf tin, covered with a cloth, and put it in the fridge for 24 hours. At that stage, we could then have baked it straight away, and that is the absolute minimum effort loaf that you can possibly make. It isn't as good, and I'd be lying if I said it was, but it will get you a really decent white loaf
that you can use for sandwiches, toast, etc., etc. And it will be a lot better than anything you can buy in the shops. But we're not doing that today. We're going to push through with the lift and fold knead, and this is the second one of those. This is easier with a damp or wet hand, so it's worth having a little bit of water you can just dip in. And all we're doing is, as we did before, lift, fold on itself, turn, fold, turn. Just dig in underneath the dough where it is, put it, and you can see, even after that first initial 40 minutes, it's already quite elastic and quite like a dough, without having done practically any kneading whatsoever. And that's it. So you can see it's already a much smoother, much more elastic, much stretchier dough. At the stage now where you could have spent a good 10 minutes working that out and working through the sticky dough part, but actually here it is now. We haven't done anything, and it's in a much better position. So we're going to leave that now another 40 minutes, and then we'll come back and see how it's getting on. So another 40 minutes have gone by, and we're here for another turn of the dough. As you may be able to see, it's already smoother and more dough-like than the last time we saw it. We're just going to do the same thing again. It's the lift and fold. And you just wet your hand if you need to. But at this stage, it's not even particularly sticky. You can see now, you're really starting to get that tension build up in the dough. It's still a little bit rough around the edges, but it's really starting to come together now and look like much more how you would expect a bread dough to be. So, we're going to leave that yet another 40 minutes and see how we get on. It's worth mentioning that at any point during this process, you can just pop this in the fridge and leave it there overnight, return to it tomorrow ready to shape. I think it's worth giving sort of 3 or 4 of these lift and fold turns if you've got the time to do it. I think it pays off in the finished bread. But once you've done the first ones, you can very easily just pop it in the fridge, come back to it the next day and form your loaf. Here we are then for the last turn of the day for this bread. So this is the last action on day 1. Obviously, as you can see, this has taken the best part of half a day to get to where it is. But in terms of actual hands-on time, that's been minimal. 5 or 10 minutes at most of actual hands-on time. It's just about being in that one place at the right time. So the bread now, this dough, is as if you had kneaded it for a good sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes of hard kneading. It's really stretchy, really good. It's looking lovely. We've already got some bubbles forming there, so we know the fermentation is happening. And what I'm going to do is this is going to go in the fridge now, overnight, and then tomorrow morning we'll bring it out, knock it back, and we'll form the loaf. And that's it. Okay then, so it's day 2 of our loaf of bread, and our dough here has spent the night in the fridge. Around about probably 18 hours altogether, I would say, and it's spread, it's grown, and you can see that there are air bubbles appearing all over the place now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to form it into the loaf. Start with a little bit of flour. Not too much for this first bit, because we're going to be folding it back on itself, and we don't want to fold a lot of flour into the loaf and end up with some raw uncooked flour in the middle of our loaf. So this is our dough. As you can see from yesterday, it's really smooth now, really simple to use. A little bit of stickiness there on the top, but underneath where it's been on the surface is very, very easy to handle. I'm going to go for a quick forming, and all we want to do from the folding prior for the loaf is basically build a little bit of body into there to try and help it to hold its own shape under baking. And we're going to do that through a couple of folds. So first of all, this half in a third of itself and push it in so it sticks. We're going to repeat with that side, stretch up and over, that, and then the same going the other way. A little bit more flour there, up, and press it in, up, and press it over. Then, now we know that's the outside of the loaf. All we're going to do is just reinforce that and roll it up, like we're rolling up a mattress. And this is because what we're making is a bloomer shape. So we want that long oval. Okay. Now at this stage, we can go a bit heavier on the flour. So this top side is what will become the top of the loaf. So nice heavy flour on that. So nice heavy flour on that. Give you that nice pattern at the end. And then the underside, you can see, is where we've sealed our folds. So that's our loaf. Now we just need then to pop that into something to help it to hold it in shape while it proves. Now I'm going to use a proving basket. This is a proper proving basket with a cloth on the inside made of wooden slats. And what that does, it's really the best method of doing it because this allows a little bit of airflow on the inside, which allows the outside of that loaf to dry out a little bit, so it again holds that crust and holds its shape. But we've talked a lot about not needing fancy equipment to do this and not needing anything other than what you've got kicking around. I can show you my previous proving baskets that I used before I treated myself. To begin with, I started with something like this. So it's an oven tray, a couple of old jars, and some greaseproof paper. Popping the loaf in there, just so it holds its shape, and covering with a damp cloth. That was my first method. I then progressed to an old loaf tin lined with greaseproof paper. Just popping the loaf in there gives you a bit more room to cover it. That also worked pretty well. But this is a lot better, and that's because of that airflow around the outside. I'm not saying rush out and buy a proper proving basket now. What I would say, if, like I did, make some loaves, get used to it, use the stuff you've got, and if you find you're enjoying it and you're making enough to make it worthwhile, then go out and make the investment. But don't rush out and buy all the kit now until you've really got something under your belt. So, we'll take our loaf then, and we'll pop it in there. So on the top of that, you can see the seal from where we folded, okay? That will eventually become the bottom of the loaf. All we're going to do now, clean cloth on top, give it a bit of a spray with some water, and that's just to help it stay damp while it proves. This will leave out now at room temperature for about 2 hours, and it should be ready to bake. It's come directly out of the fridge, so it is fridge cold in this point of time. We could, if we wanted to, pop this now back in the fridge overnight and cook it tomorrow. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Personally, I'm not convinced that it adds much to the flavour or to the texture, although I know a lot of people do swear by that extra long fermentation to develop the flavour and increase the air and the texture inside. I personally, through experimentation, haven't found that for me it makes an awful lot of difference. But again, it's about managing your own time. If I wanted to, I could pop this now in the fridge and not worry about it again till tomorrow. Again, pushing that idea that we can spend just a few minutes hands-on time, we can really make our lives easy and convenient when making this bread. But I'm going to leave this to rest at room temperature, and we'll be back in a couple of hours. Okay then, So the bread's been proving now for about half an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my oven on now to give it a good hour to preheat and get properly up to temperature. You need a really hot oven to get a good loaf. Hotter realistically than most ovens you get in domestic kitchens are going to get, but we work with what we've got. The other thing you can't get from a domestic oven is the kind of steam injection that bakers use. So what we're going to do is we're going to approximate that with a tray in the bottom. So, tray goes in and we're going to fill it with water. As the oven heats up, that'll create steam and that will make for a great condition for baking the bread. Steam helps the bread not only to rise quickly, but also to create that crisp crust around the outside that we know and love from sourdough. In addition, I don't have a baking stone or anything like that, so what I'm going to use is an upturned oven tray. This slides in right at the beginning, and again, we're going to keep that in there while the oven preheats to make sure it's good and hot. So when we drop the loaf straight onto that oven tray, we're going to get a real nice oven spring, which means literally it springs and rises up really quickly and gives you that nice rounded edge that we so want in our bloomer. Okay, I'm going to turn this oven on and we'll give it another hour or so and we'll get the bread in. Right then, so our bread has had its second proof, formed as a loaf. The oven's preheating and we're ready now to be thinking about getting the bread into the oven. To this end, we've got the paddle. It's technically called a peel, I think. I call it my paddle. And what we're going to do is to make sliding the bread into the oven super easy. I've had plenty of disasters in the past where a bit of the bread is stuck to part of the paddle or not slid off properly, and you just end up with a perfectly edible loaf of bread, but the shaping of it looks horrendous. So what I do, a little bit of baking paper on top of there, and it just means the bread will slide off with the baking paper straight onto the baking sheet, and it will all be good. So here's our bread. We know it's ready for baking, because what we're going to do is poke it. When you poke it, you probably won't be able to see, but when you poke it, it makes a little indentation and then slowly forms back out. And that means it's ready to bake. If I pushed in and the indentation stayed, it would mean that it was overproofed, and if it just comes straight back out, it means it's underproofed. Under is better than over. If it's really overproofed, the best thing to do is knock it back, reform the loaf and let it prove over again. Underproofed will still bake and you'll still get a good rise out of it. So, we're going to just very carefully tip the loaf onto there and slowly remove the basket. You might find at that stage that some of the bread will stick to, particularly if you're using the loaf tin or something like that, you might find the bread will stick a little bit as you're pulling it away. Just be gentle with it, be patient, and just gently push it away, and because otherwise you're going to rip it and you'll end up again with a perfectly decent loaf of bread, but it won't look quite as good. Again, like the proving basket, don't rush out and buy yourself a peel or a paddle, whatever it's called, until you've made a few loaves and you're confident you're going to get the use out of it. Up until just a couple of months ago, this is what I was using for my peel, paddle, whatever. This is what I was using for my paddle. It's a plastic document wallet. I just put the bread on and just slide into the oven like that. Worked perfectly well, gave me perfectly decent bread. This is just a little bit nicer. So, it's important at this stage that we cut some slashes into the bread. You'll see on Instagram and that all these beautiful pattern slashes that people make. I tend to just hack it into sort of 3 or 4 cuts across. The best thing to do this with is a razor blade. I just use an old fish filleting knife. It's a long, straight, thin blade.
it's pretty much the same job. And all we're going to do is just going to cut about a centimetre or so into the bread itself. So and all that's going to do, aside from looking pretty when the loaf is done, it allows your loaf to expand where you want it to expand. If you don't slash it, it'll burst out wherever it feels weakest, usually underneath where you've made those folds from earlier on, and it'll end up just wonky and, again, still perfectly decent, still completely edible, but just not quite as pretty. I'm going to give that a little spray with some water. Again, like we spoke about earlier on, just helps you get that crust and get it to expand in the places that we want it to expand, not from the edges or anything like that. And what I've done is this is about probably 10 minutes now before I want to put it in the oven. I'm just going to allow those cuts a little bit of time to open up and a little bit of time to finish the rise with those cuts in it. And we'll see it with the oven. Okay, and here we have the finished loaf. So it's been baked, it's ready. To check that it's ready, when it was still in the oven, what we did is tip it upside down and just tap the bottom. You can hear it sounds as if it's hollow. If you didn't catch that, there we are. So, it is not the prettiest sourdough loaf you are ever going to see. It's not going to be a star of the Instagram. It hasn't got perfect ears, but what it is a tasty, good loaf. And it's one that I make 2 or 3 times every week, and I can't remember the last time I had to buy a loaf of bread. If you get into regularly making this, from there you can try all the different kinds of flour, you can up your levels of hydration, you can use your Dutch ovens, and you can push and get that Instagram perfect loaf. But this is a really good loaf to eat, and that's what's important. So we do just have to do the Instagram compulsory cut in half and have a look though. There we are. So that is this plain, simple sourdough loaf. Full instructions on www.partisanblog.com, where you'll find the recipe, the measurements, the timings, all that good stuff. So visit us there, like and subscribe on this, come and see us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and yeah, let me know what you think. Cheers!